On this episode of China Unscripted, China seeks to create a new world order, and the Belt and Road is the key. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganeshta.
And this podcast is sponsored by Drake Illusion. Drake Illusion is a software company that offers a cloud computing solution to manage all aspects of your business: accounting, product management, inventory, and more. Drake Illusion ERP system is capable of replacing your QuickBooks and provides a solution that can grow with your business. An enterprise solution for your small or mid-sized company is now available at your fingertips. Now, joining us today is Toufic Sarieddine, a Lebanese graduate scholar enrolled in the Graduate School of International Development at Nagoya University, Japan. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, guys.
So you did a very interesting research about, to put it in layman's terms, I think you're basically saying China is forming a new world order.
Yep.
But the specific term you use is world systems theory. So kind of explain what that means and like how China is forming a new world order.
Sure. So world systems theory is actually a school of thought in international relations, which was pioneered by a guy called Emanuel Wallerstein in the 1970s and 80s. And it holds that, just like dependency theory, the world is made up of core states and periphery states, but also semi-periphery states, those who are in the middle who may go one way or the other. Mm-hmm. And world systems theory is just one theory. It's not multiple ones. It's also called world systems analysis. And it holds that states are illusory. There's no such thing as a state. It just demarcates particular zones of taxation and sometimes, linguistic differences between, across stretches of land. But in essence, the world is one capitalist world system where you have core processes, and these are high-yielding processes. They generate a lot of revenue for wherever they're hosted, as opposed to periphery processes, which don't generate as much revenue and which don't require a lot of special training. For example, a core industry would be smartphones, and a peripheral industry would be mining the ore for those smartphones. So one smartphone can have like a very small amount of ore, and it's multiple times the price of its weight in ore. But it requires a lot of specialized technology to produce it and to market it as well. And so world systems theory holds that it's not particularly states that are core or peripheral, it's processes. And the more processes that are high yielding within a given boundary, the higher the status of that state on the core and periphery binary, if you will.
So it's kind of like how China was pushing the whole Made in China 2025 thing. They want more and more...
it's like high-end manufacturing in China, and that helps China become powerful.
Well, yes, high-end manufacturing does. If it's a high-yielding industry, that it does elevate China's status or its standing in the world. But China remains, according to world systems theory, a semi-periphery because it still can't quite assert itself without, it's still kind of wary of U.S. sanctions, of EU sanctions, because that's where the money is. That's the key to its continued economic growth and its continued ascension. So it has to kind of play by the rules, as visibly as it can, for better or for worse, as it becomes more and more powerful. But in terms of China's manufacturing campaign, again, it depends on what it's manufacturing. If it's manufacturing low-grade goods, it doesn't really push it that much because low-grade goods would be peripheral products, and those would keep a country peripheral.
So in terms of world systems theory, what are some of the core things that you want to be able to control as a country that would make you like more in the core and not periphery?
Yes, that's a great question, as all of them will be, of course.
I like this guy.
What makes a country a core state in world systems theory is its ability to project influence in multiple ways. The first way, of course, is economic dominance. So it wants to dominate economically, not just within the borders itself, but across the borders. And economic dominance is done in three ways, and these happen in order. So let's take the example of China and Pakistan, which is what my research currently is about. In terms of economic dominance, there's three components: production dominance, trade dominance, then financial dominance. Production dominance begins when the country that wants to become a core state can produce goods that are of a higher quality than the competition and can outdo whatever competition is there locally inside the periphery. So Huawei phones, for example, if they're outdoing Samsung and the iPhone, it's kind of pushing away the American grip. Also, if China's producing like other electronics, it's pushing away the EU, Germany, Japan as well. Not the EU, but you know what I mean. So that's production dominance. They can also produce them in large quantities because China is a huge economy, whereas Pakistan has many issues when it comes to maintaining a high enough level of production and a high enough quality of production. So in Pakistan right now, Chinese goods are outdoing Pakistani goods if they're the same, if it's the same industry. So that's production dominance. Second is trade dominance. And mind you, for a country to be a core state with respect to a periphery, more money must be entering the core from the periphery than vice versa. And so when it comes to trade dominance, the core wants to be indispensable to the periphery, but the periphery can be dispensable to the core. So China right now is Pakistan's number one source of imports. However, this is not mutual. Pakistan is nowhere near China's number one source of imports. It's highest in agricultural imports from Pakistan. So as you know, China is not a country that has a lot of arable land. And as its economic situation improves, there'll be more demand for agricultural products. And this makes producers of agricultural goods such as Vietnam, Thailand, Pakistan, it makes their agriculture more in demand. And so right now, Pakistan is the third source of rice for China. So in this way, China is able to project its trade dominance over Pakistan. It's essentially being like, okay, Pakistan, I don't need you. You need me. You need these goods, and my goods can outdo yours and can outdo the other country's goods. But I don't need your rice as much as I need Vietnam's rice or Thailand's rice. So you behave yourself.
Well, I know a lot of your research focused on China's relationship with the Middle East and North Africa. And so is it a case where China is trying to become, to these places, a core country?
Yeah. I mean, yes, certainly. Now, it's not being loud and obnoxious about its ambitions, but it is quietly making gains in the Middle East and North Africa. You may have heard about the recent pact that it made with Iran. China is trying to be on good terms with everybody in the region. And China is interested in all the countries where it sees opportunity. Egypt, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, for different reasons. Saudi Arabia, obviously, for the energy sector, there's mutual investment in that regard. Also for infrastructure, China actually built a railway from Mecca to Medina a few years ago. So there's many opportunities for China to invest and to be a part of economic activity there. In terms of other forms of dominance, this actually, going back to Shelley's question, another way that states project their dominance is through something I call a new modi operandi, or new modes of production. All hegemonies kind of project a new way of acting and thinking. In fact, an arbitration expert called Xin Wei says that the BRI is not as much as it's an infrastructure project, but it's also a way to socialize states. So it's making states think and act in a way that is more in line with how China runs things. Mm-hmm. And this, one of the ways it does this is through stipulations in the BRI contracts that state that any kind of litigation regarding misunderstandings or regarding problems with BRI projects are to be resolved in Chinese courts. Mm. This means there's an expansion of China's jurisdiction across its borders to these places where BRI projects are happening. Further, in terms of the law of the sea, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, a state's only entitled to so many nautical miles off its shore to extract and exploit resources. China does not agree with this because, as you know, it wants all the South China Sea for itself. Now, some Arab states are on board with this. They agree with China, and I don't think they're doing it just because of the idea of it. They're also doing it to kind of curry favor and with China and return some perks, here and there. So in these ways, China is kind of slowly molding these states. And, the Gulf is monarchies where ruling is top down anyway. And China likes ruling top down. It's not very big on organic democracies from the bottom up. And so the Gulf and China, their relationship is good. It's going stronger. North Africa's, it's on a case-by-case basis, especially with Libya now being the way it is. But that's another way that China is projecting itself. And yes, it certainly would like to be the core, but I can't really say what China's intentions are. But if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, but it's not really quacking like a duck yet. It's being a very quiet, well-behaved fowl, if I may.
So when you said that the BRI is a way of socializing countries, obviously China has other ways to do this to kind of influence countries to agree with them on their international issues or whatever. But I was thinking also of like when Pakistan and the economic corridor there, like in your way of looking at things, is BRI and like the CPEC, like they're primarily economic in nature and they just happen to have these other benefits, or is this like a more concerted, like a more strategic way for the Chinese Communist Party to gain influence in the world? Like they're not just looking at this economically, but they're looking at it from all of these like kind of like power aspects.
Real quick, in case we haven't said it, BRI, Belt and Road Initiative.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Again, I can't say what the Communist Party's intentions are. I can only look at the actions on the ground. So far, what it seems to me is that it entered Pakistan from the gateway of economic cooperation. Right after 2011, when Bin Laden was assassinated by the U.S. on Pakistani land, Pakistan faced a lot of international condemnation for hosting this terrorist over there. And so it found an ally in China then. And even before this happened, China and Pakistan were stepping up their trade relations. But recently, the relationship has deepened much more so. And it's not only economic, because even though I think China wants economic gains first and foremost, China is partnering with Pakistan's military. And Pakistan's military is now more assertive than it's ever been in a civilian government, because Pakistan has had military coups before. But right now, there's a civilian government. However, the military keeps getting more and more power, and also it has more and more presence in autonomous regions of Pakistan, such as Balochistan. Balochistan, for those who don't know, is an area that borders Pakistan and Iran, and it's people. There's secessionist movements there, and there's secessionist movements in China as well. And this makes and China is very allergic to secessionist movements. It hates them. It wants like a unity, even if it's not artificial unity. It just wants the bloc to remain the way it is. And so it's doing whatever it can to empower. I don't think it's doing whatever it can, but a consequence of China partnering with the military and having the military get all these extra perks through government legislation is that the military is able to assert control over these once tumultuous areas at Balochistan. In fact, if you look at CPEC, it runs from China's westernmost city of Kashgar through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. It ends in the port of Gwadar, which is in Balochistan. But the trajectory is a very cautious one. It doesn't go really deep into Balochistan. It goes in a straight line down to the coast, and then across the coast from Karachi to Gwadar. And so in this way, China is transforming Pakistan politically as well. So it starts economically, then becomes politically, and the army is a very efficient instrument. It's a proxy, essentially. One more thing is that recently, so in Pakistan, like I said, usually areas are quite autonomous. However, there was a motion passed recently in the Pakistani Senate to create a centralized body that would govern national development initiatives. It's called the National Development Coastal Authority. However, what's interesting is that each city along the coast of Pakistan has its own development office. And so this whole initiative to centralize power within the government, many critics have said, is just makes it easier for China to control the whole country by strengthening the government's control over the country. So that's another political consequence of CPEC.
Also, and that's the CPEC is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor.
China-Pakistan Economic Corridor.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you're talking about how the Belt and Road is affecting the politics in these states, because I've heard the analysis that the Belt and Road goes through Xinjiang, and I've heard that a lot of the reason the Communist Party is cracking down in Xinjiang is to create a stable environment for the Belt and Road. So as you were mentioning, this is very interesting how the economic beginnings of the Belt and Road inevitably transform into political aspiration.
Of course, yes.
So I guess the question is, the Chinese Communist Party, obviously through the Belt and Road, is trying to influence the politics of these countries. Meanwhile, you have the Western world also trying to have a degree of influence on these countries, but those usually come with certain humanitarian or human rights concerns as well. China doesn't have that. So how is this affecting all of these countries being tied up by the Belt and Road?
Well, as you said, when we talk about aid and foreign direct investment, some states like the EU, for example, they place a high importance on social justice, on human rights, on democracy, so on and so forth. For China, it's all about economic development. China thinks that the way to develop a country is through economic development. But International Development 101 says that if you just pump money into a state with existing inequalities, you're going to those inequalities become greater, because whoever controls like the factories or whatever, the managers will get richer. The workers might not see such a big increase in their wages. Similarly, for ethnic violence or things like that, I'm not optimistic about it. But when it comes to governance processes, China is not like interestingly enough, China doesn't really export its ideals as aggressively as the United States when it comes to women's rights, for example. Because in China, because of the one-child policy, women have had to enter the workplace as well. Whereas China is entering alliances with Iran, for example, which is a very sexist country, and also has economic relations with Saudi Arabia, and it doesn't really put pressure on them to improve the status of certain minorities there. It just wants stability. Get it done whatever way you want it to get done, but I want stability so I can invest.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say that China cares about women's rights in China either. I mean, the whole having women work, it's a production issue. It's that you can essentially mobilize, and this was Mao's theory too, that you can then you can mobilize like the entire population instead of only half the population as the workers, right? So
if the Communist Party cared about women's rights, they wouldn't force them to be sterilized or force them to have abortions.
No, or just even this whole campaign to try to make women have guilt women into having babies younger is because they're looking at it from the perspective of what is best for the state, what is best for the party state, right? So I'm not surprised that they don't have a problem with how Iran treats women, because they would, if circumstances were different, they would not have trouble treating women the same way.
Maybe, but also on the point of politics in these states, depending on how influential the West remains in the states where the BRI is, China will become the hegemony. This is my whole argument, is that through the Belt and Road, China is creating a new world system where it will be the core, and it will have these peripheries which are all indentured to it, and China calls the shots in them. And this is all for economic gain. But also, if it exports its ideology, like the way Iran does, Iran exports its revolutionary Islamic ideology to get itself more credibility on the world stage. Like, oh, we're not the only ones who believe in this. So do the Houthis. So does Hezbollah. So it's either all of us are this way or none of us are this way. Iran's a lot more aggressive and difficult in this regard. But maybe I don't know that much about China's history of trying to export its model. But this is, in the least, this is what I can tell you, is that it looks like China has the components to become a hegemony in a new Belt and Road initiative. I call it the BRI bound world system. So it's going to be a world system comprised of these states which have a lot of which have at least one Belt and Road project occurring right now. And how a state becomes peripheralized, so it becomes a periphery of China, is after what world systems theory outlines the indicators that have to be met. We talked about production dominance, economic dominance, new modes of operation. There's also a very important factor in all hegemonies have had across the ages, shall we say. So world systems analysis essentially is a historical analysis tool. It's not only about international relations, it also looks at history, at long periods of history. And the first hegemony was the United Provinces, which is today the Netherlands. They rallied peripheries not only economically and with law, but also around an anthem, a cause, a general interest. And the general interest of the United Provinces at the time was state sovereignty, right? So Treaty of Westphalia, respect my borders, I'll respect yours. The U.S.'s general interest is democracy, and whereas we have to spread democracy around the world. China's general interest is infrastructure, because China has the capacity and has the surplus production in steel and other infrastructure, not raw material, and has the framework to export a lot of infrastructure and to construct a lot of infrastructure at a time when the world needs a lot of it. In Asia, it needs. I saw like an estimate of billions of dollars of necessary infrastructure investment. Africa, same thing. Certain Asian states alone cannot satisfy their own infrastructure needs. Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, Nepal, they don't have the revenue to fund their own infrastructure needs. Japan, of course, does. This is why Japan is not as influenced by China. But these countries need China, and China's general interest is infrastructure. It's not saying, you should respect women, or you should this is the Declaration of Human Rights or whatever. It just says, hey, you need a railway and I can build it for you. But also, of course, a consequence of this is that in its pursuit of the most efficient ways of governance, I think it regards democracy as secondary in importance. As long as the policy gets passed, I don't think it cares how it gets passed, as long as it gets passed.
It's interesting when you compare the philosophies of these general interest, because like the U.S. is this sort of idea of democracy and power to the individuals,
individual liberty, freedoms, that kind of stuff.
The Netherlands, for what it's worth, sovereignty and respect for that. And like China's is like this very Marxist materialist means of production philosophy, right? That has nothing to do with the people. It's all about like creating material goods, and which of course benefits China, but also it's just a very materialistic Marxist philosophical idea when compared to what the U.S. and the Netherlands
that's interesting, because I was thinking when you were talking, Toufic, that like, infrastructure is not really an ideology, but you're saying, Matt, that you think it is.
It sounds from what you're saying, Toufic, that it is ideological. That infrastructure is like the goal is more material goods versus a sort of liberty or sovereignty idea.
Even though those rails that they are building are garbage and fall apart. The bridges fall apart.
Yeah, but they do benefit China, so it doesn't matter.
Well, I've never really thought about it from that point of view. When I think Marxism, I think means of production, and yeah, China does have the means of production in this regard. So, but certainly, I would agree with you that China's general interest is more materialistic than other hegemonies of the past. Unless you consider that the state as a material, structure would also safeguard whatever material production is going on inside it, which makes the United Provinces also materialistic in what it propagated. And also the US idea of democracy and human rights maybe wanted to, maybe was leading up to the optimal functioning of a state is one that is democratic and respects human rights. So the states that would have the highest revenue and the highest human development index are those that have human rights and are democracies, which is true for the most part.
Right. Although I would say correlation, yes. Causation, perhaps, is a bit more complex.
Exactly. International affairs is it's not STEM. There's many things that could be happening, and we try to draw little theories here and there. Yeah.
So according to your research, what ultimately will happen as China becomes more of a hegemony, as it gets all of these more and more periphery states under its control, as that rams up against sort of a Western democratic hegemony? These two competing powers.
Yes. So just off the bat, I can tell you that Mandarin will be more widely spoken.
Chandama.
The phrase "okay," you know what I mean? Okay. People use it a lot, even in Japan, even where I'm from. Just okay, and I think the okay is like a nugget of American linguistic hegemony. So I think in maybe 20, 30 years time, if things remain the way they are, you'd have maybe Kenyans saying "xie xie" or Pakistanis, because certainly right now in Pakistan, the Senate passed a resolution that states that the learning of Mandarin should be more facilitated for government contractors who are working in CPEC, which are like tens of thousands of people. So this is a huge injection of Mandarin. That's one thing. Another one would be perhaps yuanization, so more transactions done in the yuan as opposed to the dollar. This is also part of financial dominance, which goes back to economic dominance. You'd have more of the world's reserves kept in China. So now a lot of the world's gold reserves are kept in the US. But as China advances more and more in creating this BRI bound world system, a lot of the world's money will be kept in the US. And also China will have more control of the world's assets. Actually, in Pakistan, for example, China bought a huge stake in Pakistan Stock Exchange. They'll just be more looking eastward instead of looking westward. I haven't really seen, like, the one thing that in my limited research, the one thing that I've seen the West has a clear advantage over China is media and being cool. You know what I mean? That kind of cultural hegemony thing. But the West, it's a hit and miss. Like in Lebanon, for example, liking the West is the political thing. If you want to emulate Western people and you listen to bands and stuff like that, it could associate you with being okay with America's support for Israel, and Israel is not popular where I'm from. And so I think China can take advantage of where the West has failed, because it has failed in some places. In some parts, the US talks about human rights and democracy, but at the same time, Saudi Arabia just allowed women to drive a few years ago. So some places are really fertile for China to come in and be like, okay, I'm your new hegemony now. But it's not going to do that as forcefully, because, again, the EU and the US have a much more established presence on the world stage, especially in the Middle East. And in my research article, I argue that China has the power to make Lebanon one of its peripheries, but it failed to do so because it was already crushing competition from the US and the EU. In fact, here's an example. In Lebanon, okay, the de facto governors of the country is Hezbollah. Hezbollah is an Iran-backed militia. Now, the problem is that Hezbollah is backing a corrupt government, and the president, his son-in-law, was beautifully slapped recently with American sanctions for corruption. Yet Hezbollah keeps backing him, and Iran keeps backing Hezbollah. When we had our revolution in 2019 that called for a better state, Hezbollah, the leader of Hezbollah, went on TV and said that we should look east towards China and its investments and not look at the West anymore. And this is because China does have the capacity, he thinks, to create, more power plants and bridges and so on and so forth. At a time when Lebanon still does not have 24-hour electricity, and we could really use the power plants. But after I did my research to find out why these projects haven't happened, there's many political and economic hurdles that China faces when dealing with Lebanon, such as a tumultuous political situation, such as the preeminence of the US and the EU, and their proxies preventing Chinese investment in this way. So Lebanon is kind of like, looks like it's going to be the border of the Belt and Road bound world system. Like, it's not going to completely take it. Maybe it'll focus on one place that I think is the port of Tripoli for various reasons. But that is one like battleground right there. So it's not going to be a complete one if the West maintains its grip, for better or for worse.
Do you see other places like this in the Middle East where it's not going to be, because China is pretty new to kind of coming to the Middle East specifically, and it's a complicated place with a lot of complicated histories, as you were mentioning. So are there other places you see in the Middle East where it's going to be maybe tougher for China to get in than it was for them in other parts of Africa or Southeast Asia, places like that?
Interestingly enough, Syria has yet to sign on to the Belt and Road Initiative. Even though Syria and China are, they're allies in multiple ways. But I think in Syria, because there's so many players, there's Turkey, there's Russia, there's Iran right now, the US presence is still there. You have the Kurds who are being more assertive. China's also maybe finding a hard time, getting into there as well. But apart from that, I don't think there's going to be like a massive transformation of one Middle Eastern state into a complete Chinese periphery. I don't think it's the case yet. However, through China's partnership with Iran and through Iran's influence on Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, and Syria, this could be a gateway of propagating Chinese influence through Iran. Other states don't have that much proxy power in the Middle East.
Well, I'm curious how China is able to, kind of as Shelley was saying, manage all of these different factions in the Middle East. For instance, China is invested in Iran and Saudi Arabia and Israel. That doesn't really seem like those all go together.
That's right, they don't. But well, China's policy is a lot like Japan's policy in that because they're strangers in this neighborhood, they want to make good relations with everyone. And the governors of those states are aware of this. They're aware they're aware that China can't possibly miss out on the Saudi Gulf market. The governors of Iran know that China's obviously not going to miss out on the Saudi oil market, and Saudi Arabia knows that China obviously can't miss out on Iran's influence and also Iran's liquefied natural gas, which it has a lot of. And once the sanctions are waived, bam, you're going to see liquefied natural gas moving across the borders like crazy. So the governors there are fully aware, are mature enough, as a governor should be, to understand that China wants money. It just wants to conduct business. It doesn't really care much about the problems on the ground. It doesn't, its heart doesn't bleed for the Palestinians, or it's not a Zionist state per se. It's an atheist country, so it doesn't really care about everyone's religion. It just wants business to be conducted, and it wants a stable environment, which is why I'm cautiously optimistic about China entering the area, because it means that the governors in the Middle East will like be quick to like stabilize things. Okay, guys, calm down. We don't need financial aid from the EU anymore. So now China's coming. We need to really behave ourselves, because what happened before, I think, is that the EU is right next to the Middle East. Chaos in the Middle East means refugees to the EU. The EU does not want refugees, so the EU sends aid to the Middle East to stabilize it. What the corrupt governors do is that they siphon a lot of this aid and they give just enough for things to stay like the way they are. You know what I mean? It doesn't really improve them, but doesn't make them worse. And I argue that a lot of Lebanese politicians' fortunes are made off of Europeans' taxes. And in that kind of vicious cycle. But when it comes to China, China doesn't give aid. It finances projects. It doesn't invest as much as in Europe or America, but it finances projects selectively, cautiously, and it does so with the money of the people, because a lot of companies are state-owned enterprises. So it doesn't have that much money to give as bribes or whatever. And I think it's failed to do so in Lebanon. There's only one BRI project in Lebanon, which is a conservatory of music, which is much appreciated, but it's not like
it's not nuclear power plants.
Yeah, it's not nuclear power plants or anything like that. Although we do have like some Mandarin courses being taught at universities, but and actually exports to China are increasing. And in Lebanon, we could use all the export destinations we can get.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that the European investment in Lebanon and other parts of the Middle East is done so poorly that Chinese investment is actually marginally better?
I wouldn't call it European investment. I'd call it European aid.
So aid is a type of investment, but because in theory, the aid is supposed to help the people on the ground.
Stabilize the place.
But it's instead just enriching certain people who already have some means. But you had also said earlier in the podcast that Chinese investment also tends to enrich people who already have means, and it doesn't reduce inequality. So basically, no matter who invests in the Middle East, the people on the ground are getting screwed, and the people who already have money are just going to make more.
How's that? I think it's on a case-by-case basis. I think that a power plant, for example, it doesn't make things as worse as a project that is the result of a deal struck by a warlord, for example. Power plants, if they're owned by the state, would produce revenue for the state. But if the person in charge of the Ministry of Energy is corrupt, then they might leech off of that. But the way certain governments are structured prevents China or prevents the state from enriching itself in this manner. Like, we're not going to have a Sri Lanka situation because our ports are all owned by the state, and the state is unwilling to give China what's called a sovereign.
Basically, the 99-year lease, where essentially China controls it.
Sovereign guarantee, which means that if China doesn't, which means that the state itself strikes the loan deal with China, and Lebanon has so far not done so. In terms of the entire Middle East, I can't really say, but I will say that economic development alone. I wish it would solve all the problems on the ground. But if you take, for example, the Israel-Palestine issue, and you economically develop both areas, it's not going to change. The idea that settlers had, they can just like take this land. They'll just go with segways instead of on foot. You know what I mean? As long as certain ideologies and certain deeply held theocratic impulses are there, no matter how much money or how much development you put into a place, things will just manifest in different ways. And this is the limitation of China's development model, I think.
It's interesting because, like, China will say, like, it says it supports Palestine. Like, that's their official position, right? They're like sympathetic or supportive of the Palestinian issue, but that's not going to stop them from wanting to do business with Israel and all their high-tech companies.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, they have, they've done the good soundbite here and there of like, Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine, but they don't they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk, and they don't talk the talk that often or that assertively. You know what I mean? Like, Iran talks the talk very assertively to the point of nausea, and it walks the walk very sloppily, whereas China talks the talk. It does some financing in the Palestinian territories, but its main business is with Israel in that area. So I think it did the whole Palestine thing as a way to be a champion for the global South and to get favor from the Palestinians there who feel betrayed by the West. Like, the same West that champions human rights and democracy and whatever is failing to stop settler violence and stuff like that. Not that there's not violence on both sides, there is. But when I talk to people on the ground, they say, if they're so good, why don't they stop the settlers? Just make a law that stops the settlements. Why do they keep going on? And mind you, though, I don't think China's that passionate about what either person is doing, what either entity is doing. It just, sees a neighborhood and it wants to renovate, it wants to invest. You know what I mean? So I think it was just a soundbite to get the Global South champion points.
I think it's interesting what you said earlier about how you thought that it might get better because China comes into the Middle East and it's like a pragmatic thing. But how does this kind of, because like the other thing that like is one, I think, of the few things that the Chinese Communist Party is especially keen on is non-interference in other countries' affairs, because they don't want anybody else interfering in their affairs when they talk about that. So it seems like they wouldn't actually want to make any moves in the Middle East for that reason.
Yes, very much so. China does adhere very strongly to non-interference, but the more it's involved in the Middle East, the more like shaky this commitment becomes. Because if you strike a military pact with Iran, and you just say, "Oh, it's just between me and Iran," blah blah blah. But what if Iran, conducts an aggression against Saudi Arabia or against Iraq? What then, China? Well, are you sure you can fulfill this commitment? So China's really walking on eggshells when it comes to non-interference. And non-interference, what does that really mean? You know what I mean? I mean, does non-interference mean boots on the ground in another country's state, or does it mean aggressive investment in another country that would disenfranchise some people there and benefit China? So I think non-interference is it sounds noble and cute, but I don't think it's sincere. And I don't think that interference can occur just militarily, but also very much economically. We're witnessing an economic war right now, and there's certainly interference on from all sides to all sides.
Well, as you mentioned in world systems theory, a core state can have many ways to influence periphery states. It doesn't have to be militarily.
It's so interesting because I just saw this article on Xinhua last week about how China will never become a hegemony. And that was basically the only thing it said. It was just like, we will never have a hegemony. We will never have spheres of influence. We're just not going to do this.
It's like China's never going to militarize islands in the South China Sea.
I think it depends. Well, Xinhua, we all know who runs Xinhua. And I think it's a very clever thing for China to say that, oh, we're not doing anything. We're just doing business. You know what I mean? But if you look at the footprints, where the trajectory is, and people have termed China's moves as going towards a reluctant hegemony. Like, it doesn't really want it, but it might get it. Like, China's trying to look as harmless as possible to the West. Like, not like Russia. Russia doesn't care. Russia's like, Crimea is mine. What? China's a lot more polite because China depends more on revenue from the U.S. and the West.
Well, except for Taiwan. Taiwan belongs to them.
Yes, right. Yeah, Tibet also, and Xinjiang also, and I mean, I respect. I respect that. I'm not here to challenge these claims, but they're autonomous regions for a reason. At least as autonomous as they can be.
Well, so also from the lens of world systems theory, so it's interesting because like the U.S. essentially, let's call it the global hegemon, but then you have smaller, from the U.S. perspective, semi-periphery or periphery states, but they are also trying to become, in a way, their own core states. So China versus India, those are the two big regional powers in the Indo-Pacific. A lot of China's interests in Pakistan is to make sure India doesn't become the core state of the Indo-Pacific.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a whole field in world systems theory, not a field, but like there's a whole sub-study about how semi-peripheries compete to reach the top because there's not a lot of room in the core. Like at one point Spain was a core, and then it slipped down. It's pyramidal for a reason, and not everybody can be in the core. So indeed, there is heavy balancing going on, and that is certainly one encouragement for China and Pakistan to deepen their relationship, which is when they first established relations in the 50s, It was primarily military based to balance India. And that's why China gave Pakistan nuclear know-how and missiles and stuff like that.
So you were saying the ways a core state influences the peripheries is through, was it economics, trade, and finance?
So those fall under economic dominance, production, trade, and finance. The economic dominance. Then there's the modi operandi, which is new legal codes, also the yuanization, using yuan more, socializing the states essentially. Also, other institutions, which like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, being a counterpart to, for example, the IMF. It can also finance projects without the constraints of the IMF. So these alternative institutions are part of this alternative world system.
How China tries to sinicize other places, in other words?
I don't think they. I don't know what its intention. I can't say what its intentions are. I can only tell you what the data is so far. I can't tell you, oh, it wants to do this and it wants to do that. It seems very, very likely that this is its intention, at least with states like Pakistan, which are so important to it.
Well, I think what I was getting at is you're talking about how the core influences the periphery. You have economic things, and then it seems like what you were describing is sort of changing the way a country thinks. What's next?
The general interest of infrastructure that I spoke about earlier. And there's other manifestations, Gramsci and Wallerstein agree that culture and language are also manifestations of hegemony. So this goes into cultural exchanges between countries. I haven't seen it that strongly because I haven't looked at it that well, but I think that is the weak point of China is like cultural soft power. And it failed in the Middle East to really implant cultural soft power. It may be more successful in Pakistan, especially because Pakistan has a lot of WeChat users and a lot of schools that are making Mandarin obligatory. It's no longer just, oh, you can either take English or Mandarin. No, you will take Mandarin in addition to whatever other languages. And also through legislation that makes that the Senate took, as I mentioned, to make people who work in CPAC learn Mandarin quicker, which are tens of thousands of people. So this will permanently change Pakistan. What the U.S. can do in this regard, if we're talking about what the U.S. can and should do, one of the few advantages the U.S. still has left in Pakistan is that the U.S. is Pakistan's #1 export destination. So long as this is the case, China's peripheralization remains imperfect. But China's imports from Pakistan are increasing as China changes what Pakistan is producing. So under economic and trade production, you have changing of not only what is produced, but how much of it is produced to satisfy the core's demand. So if China wants more rice, it will make Pakistan produce more rice for it at the expense of, for example, car factories or core processes that would empower Pakistan. So what America could do is invest in core processes in Pakistan that would kind of empower it against China and be like, okay, no, I will not be weaker than you. I can do this and I can do that. You know what I mean? But I'm not saying that this is what should happen. I'm just saying these are strategies that could be considered.
Well, so we were talking earlier how the economic. Let's use Pakistan as an example. China's economic influence there creates political influence. And it seems like that political influence can also potentially lead to military influence. The port of Gwadar, China, it seems, wants that for a potential deep water port for its navy.
Yes, that's a great point. The port of Gwadar is very versatile. Now, on paper, depending on who you read, it says the port of Gwadar is actually a very good strategic point for multiple reasons. On the trade side, it's right next to the Arab Gulf. Also, exports from Pakistan are not tariffed as heavily as China's exports. And the right now, where it stands, China gets more than 80% of revenue from when it completes the port of Gwadar. So it's going to use Gwadar as a sock puppet to export its own products and get revenue that would have otherwise been lessened because of higher tariffs on itself. When it comes to military, India, of course, is the most wary of this happening. But despite China shifting more resources towards becoming a naval power, which is a mark of hegemonies as becoming a naval power, there haven't been very strong indicators that this is what's going to happen. It might, but according to what I've read, there's more data to suggest that it's going to be primarily a trade port than a military port. Maybe it might become both. I'm not sure, but according to my research, where it stands right now, it's a trade port.
Well, practically, I would think that would have to happen after China settles the Taiwan issue, for instance. I guess the ultimate question is, China, in the context of today's world, you're calling it a semi-periphery state, trying to become a hegemony, a core state. Is it possible for China, through its Belt and Road and other things they're doing, to actually succeed in supplanting the West or the U.S. as the world's core state?
That is a topic of much discussion among world systems scholarship and also, international relations theory at large. This largely depends on the actions of the West. China has a clear trajectory. It wants to increase its exports and go global. Because it wants to increase its export and go global, it has to kind of change the politics on the ground there and to make it the most receptive to Chinese interests and to Chinese demands. What happens in these countries depends to a large extent on what the West does. I saw recently that the U.S. has launched the Clean Energy Initiative, and it signed up with like a dozen or so states, including Japan. And Japan is the keenest on stopping China in this regard. But I haven't seen much oomph. You know what I mean? It's not that forceful yet. So the question of whether China will replace the U.S. is that it depends. It depends, and if it does happen, it will be slow. It will not be a process overnight. Because in West Africa, for example, you have France as the hegemony, and France is not going to sit by as China comes and takes over its previous turf. Even Russia, which China allies with closely, they dispute over Central Asia, over the stands, because Russia wants them to remain their periphery. So I don't think China will get there anytime soon, because even its closest friends don't really want it to get there. Iran, at its inception, at the inception of like modern day Iran, 1979, the Ayatollah at the time warned of the West and of China. So, it will be tricky for China to get to that level. But when it comes to an economic hegemony or some certain goals here and there, China has a good chance of achieving them, especially because China has so much infrastructure building capacity. Even though they're shoddy and some of them, there's checkered success here and there, if the West does not provide an alternative, then countries on the ground, whether or not they're bribed, may choose something shaky than nothing at all. And certainly, that would be the test of the West, is to outdo China in that regard. When it comes to Lebanon, for example, one reason that China has not fully, was not able to penetrate is because Lebanon is really close to the EU, and it's in the EU's best interest that Lebanon remains stable. And so when the EU approaches Lebanon with deals, it approaches them with low interest rates, but high costs, because European labor is more expensive than Chinese labor. Whereas China is new to the market, so it approaches with high interest rates because it wants to be cautious, but with very low labor costs for reasons such as maybe, prisoners working on these and so on and so forth. But that's, the competition is, the battlefield is economic, Ideology, I think, comes second, because you do have dictatorships that supervise, that rule over, arguably prosperous places, not the most humane places, but, prosperous places. And so I think the battle is economic at this point, and the West has to unite. Right now, I think the West is divided. Trump after Biden means like a switching of foreign policy goals, and this means that the U.S. has less time to run after China in the direction that it would have if it was one, consistent policy. Even though the U.S. has something called efficient systems behind the scenes that make sure that at least 70% of what happens stays the same no matter who's in charge. But so long as there's division in the West, I think that China has like sees like a clear way to run forward. And this ties into its strong alliance with Russia and Iran, both of which tried to influence elections in the States, but also Iran right now is trying to influence elections in Scotland to force another independence referendum to further, divide the West.
Of course, China does not interfere in other countries' political affairs.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
So it sounds like we're kind of leaving behind what's been called like the Pax Americana and headed into a future where rather than there being one major core power, you have smaller core powers all competing for each other, against each other.
Yes, exactly. In fact, the pioneer of world systems theory, Wallerstein, claimed that in 1991, of all times, when the Soviet Union was defeated, or was not defeated, sorry, it was ended, he said that 1991 was the end of Pax Americana, even though it was when America was at its most victorious. And people thought, you're insane, how is this the end when they just won? But it's because the whole system changed and they had to start over from scratch again. And right now, you see there's dents in the in American and Western hegemony when Russia can just take Crimea, for example, when Russia can interfere in Syria, for example, when China can strike deals with Iran, for example. These are all dents in America's hegemony that are being seeped into by, these gaps are being taken advantage of. Also, when it comes to institutions, Pakistan, for example, many countries owe China more money than the IMF.
Whoa.
And so the competition is multifaceted. It is the end of Pax Americana, I think, but the decline is the decline. Like who's number 2 or number 3 remains to be seen. The EU is not something to underestimate, even though they're very peaceful and whatever. They're still a force to be reckoned with. Economically, as one unified bloc, they're the biggest economy. But I think that Russia, the EU, China, it's such a thrilling race to watch, but with serious consequences, of course, for liberty and for democracy and things like that. But scholarship is divided on Pax Americana, particularly because one theory, one scholar named Goen published in 2004 that there will be no end of Pax Americana. America will remain the number one power because in the 90s and in the 70s, it created instruments with which to rein in rising competition. Japan was booming, for example, in the 80s. But then he says that certain financial agreements or somehow America strong-armed Japan into staying number 2 through certain stipulations that remain in effect to this day. Germany, same thing in the 70s. So the trade war currently between China and America is America's effort at reining in China through these financial instruments it has. The dollar is still like the most widely used currency. You have the Bretton Woods. As well. So America has many tools in its arsenal. It's not something to underestimate. It just has to, I think, unite. Once it does that and has a clear policy, then maybe the decline will cease or will happen slower.
One final question from me, at least. Earlier, you said you sort of the definition of like a core state is one that has where the peripheries depend economically on it, not the other way around. How does that apply to a situation like the United States and China, where there is a massive trade deficit?
Exactly. This makes the Chinese world system different from the USSR-US situation. So there's not going to be like that much aggression between them because they do need each other. As China is a semi-periphery, it needs the states more than the other way around. Even though both are the number one source of number one trade partners in certain respects. So I'm not quite sure. All I can tell you is that China is an ambitious semi-periphery, and it wants enough fuel to make it to the top, but it has to behave itself. And there is such a thing as supply and demand at the end of the day. No matter where ideologies stand, there is supply and demand. If something is cheap enough, even if it's made by Lucifer, people might buy it,
It is interesting that in terms of the China-US trade and investment and all this stuff, I think the Chinese Communist Party understands very clearly that it has certain economic advantages that it's trying to exploit. Like the desire for Western companies, for U.S. companies to go to China for cheap manufacturing, for the China market, that kind of stuff. But then it comes up against the U.S. dollar dominance of the world, like all of these fact that the systems are more controlled by the U.S. dollar, essentially. So one of the things that some Chinese academics have been talking about lately is the need to get people to come invest in China in order to get that dependence on China, in terms of, like, we should have Wall Street banks come in here and set up, investment funds and things like that, because then we kind of control, like, it's our playground, essentially. Like, right now they feel like financially they're still playing on the US's playground, and they will be for as long as the dollar is the dominant world currency. So
you're saying we have the best swing sets.
It's going to take a long time for China to build swing sets.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean they're not going to
do it with slave labor.
Well, but they're going to start now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They started a while ago as well. Yeah, they started a while ago. It's interesting to look at self-sufficient states. Like Iran, for example, because of U.S. sanctions, has had to rely more on its own self. And so even though it's an oil economy, it diversified its economy as much as it could in order to, for these different parts in Iran to meet each other's supply and demand. So if given the impetus, states with the capacity to chameleon or completely change their composition based on internal supply and demand may do so with some success. Because China wants to export all of its stuff, it's going to have to accommodate all of the world. And right now, the people who run most of the world is the West.
Well, that was very fascinating. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to put a link to your report in the description below. But for anyone watching who would like to learn more about you or world systems theory, where should they go?
Well, world systems theory, they should read Immanuel Wallerstein. Just look him up. Christopher Chase Dunn is also a very good world system. He's also a pioneer, really. Me, I'm just Toufic Sarieddine from Lebanon, and you can find me on LinkedIn if you would like.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you for joining us today. This was very interesting. A really unique way to look at China's rise.
Thank you so much. I hope I didn't bore anyone with my jargon, and I'm glad I could contribute a little bit to the channel. Thank you so much.
Well, so that was all very interesting, and you know what it reminded me of?
I'm afraid
Firefly, where everyone speaks a little bit of Mandarin.
No, that's a good comparison. No, in some ways, I'm serious about this, it reminds me of Star Wars. Because Star Wars, I've been watching Clone Wars a lot lately. Okay. There are the core worlds, and then there's the mid-rim worlds, and then the outer rim, which is where a lot of the original trilogy takes place. And yeah, the core worlds have all kinds of economic and political influence over all the other ones, especially because the further out you go, they're not as connected through trade routes and the like.
And I do remember there was a lot about trade in Star Wars.
Well, yeah, that's because sort of the mid and outer rim world started to unify under this trade federation to combat the core world, the Galactic Republic, that was trying to enforce its influence over those worlds.
So what you're saying is George Lucas is actually a pioneer of world systems theory?
That's exactly, galactic systems theory.
Oh, okay, yes. World systems.
World systems
theory.
Yeah. So who's the Sith Lord in this story? The one really pulling the strings?
Jiang Zemin. Or the Lizard Illuminati or something.
Demonetized.
Why, Matt? Why? We were already skating close to that with the whole talking about a new world order thing.
Yeah. There are worlds, and worlds have orders, and sometimes a new order comes about. So
yeah, it's interesting how authoritarian and dystopian that sounds, right? The new order, whatever it is.
Order.
Whatever it is.
Well, it didn't always sound authoritarian and dystopian. I think if you live in a really crummy society with a really corrupt government, you're like anything new would be better than this.
Well, it's just the idea that
What
it sounds like the order. It's not something that you as just an individual have any kind of influence or say over. It's an order being enforced upon you.
And you just have to follow orders.
Exactly. Whether it be, the Robot Federation or the Galactic Republic / Empire.
There's a robot federation?
They weren't called the Robot Federation, but they used robots for their military.
Oh, is this the clone thing?
This is the clone things,
Okay.
yeah. So the Republic
I do not know about that.
developed its own, essentially, mass-manufactured military troops with the clones.
Got it.
It's very interesting stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
Very interesting stuff. Hey, how about the Bad Batch, eh? Seen it yet? No, you haven't. And this podcast is sponsored by Drake Illusion. Drake Illusion ERP system makes it possible to manage all areas of your business. It can replace QuickBooks and do much more, from automating tasks to software development as needed. It's a cloud enterprise resource planning system that allows you to have business-to-business communication. It helps you manage multiple e-commerce platforms and shipping carriers from one centralized software. It helps you serve shoppers across all your sales channels from one solution. It's an all-in-one platform for your small or mid-sized company. Drake Illusion offers a solution that grows with your business. And now, Drake Illusion is offering up to 60% off for new clients. If you run a small or mid-sized business, Drake Illusion could be the perfect solution to save time and energy managing your company. For more info, go to www.drakeillusion.com/ERP. The link is below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
See you next time.